Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the TWAIL Symposium organized by the Research Society of International Law. Today, we have the pleasure of being joined by Usha Natarajan. Dr. Usha Natarajan is an Edward Said Fellow at Columbia University. She's a leader in the TWAIL movement and a founding editor of the TWAIL Review. Her research on environmental justice in the Global South received the International Union for Conservation of Nature Environmental Law Award. With over 40 publications, she has led global research grants from the EU and Canada and has worked with the United Nations. She is also the co-author of a very popular and very interesting book for our purposes, which is Locating Nature. Thank you so much for being with us, Usha.
Thank you, Maha. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So today we'll be talking about third world approaches to international law, how they relate to the environment, and how we can use them within international environmental law. So I'd like to jump in with the first question. Usha, in your article, Climate, Conflict, and International Law in the Middle East and Beyond, you mentioned that international law helps structure what is increasingly described as a climate apartheid. To what extent does that originate from the historical development of international law that TWAIL scholars talk about quite often?
Well, great question. So let me start by explaining what I mean by international law structuring climate apartheid, and then I'll talk about the role of history. So what I mean by climate apartheid is that there is a legal system that functions transnationally and globally that enables the wealthy few who cause climate change to insulate themselves from harm, leaving the poor masses on the front lines. We live in a world which, as you know very well, in Pakistan, where the richest 20% consume 80% of the world's natural resources, and that generate over 90% of its pollution and waste. So for most of the world, for the poorer 80%, they not only don't have equal access to resources, but they also bear the brunt of the pollution generated by the rich. So to be clear, obviously, as we're sitting here discussing this, we're not in any way separate from this problem, because even though I'm talking to you from Amman in Jordan and you're in Lahore, international law is an elite profession. So most of us tend to be within the richest 20% of the world population, even though we're living in the global south. So as we know, climate change is caused by these increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because of burning fossil fuels and by changing patterns in land use. And in terms of who's causing this, when I say the richest 20% are responsible for almost the entire problem, I'm really not exaggerating. So we just have, for example, just 2 states in the US, Texas and New Jersey, that have a combined population of 37 million people that emit the same amount of carbon dioxide as the 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. So 37 million emitting the same as 1,000 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we have these disparities that are on a scale that shows that it's not a coincidence, that it is actually a system that produces it. And today, of course, that's globalized capitalism, which makes sure that the rich not only stay rich, but that they keep getting richer. And there isn't really any incentive for the rich to change their behavior, because they don't, the impacts of climate change are borne by the poor. And for the poor, it's really a quadruple whammy, because they're on the front lines of environmental harm, first because of their vulnerable geographic location, which, as you know very well about, in Pakistan. Second, because there tends to be a lack of resources and regulatory capacity to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. And third, because they're still part of this global economy that's still extracting their natural resources and labor. That's how the global economy is fueled. And fourthly, there's also a systemic transfer of pollution from rich areas to poor areas. And that's happening globally, but also within countries, from rich areas to poor areas. So international laws and institutions are a really important part of how this injustice is structured globally. And as you have rightly pointed out in your question, this has everything to do with its disciplinary history. Because we have a discipline that its very origins, international law began as a way to allow private actors from the global north to exploit natural resources in the global south. So the first global corporations, and you see their operations, whether in the arguments of Francisco de Vitoria for free commerce in the Americas, or Hugo Grotius's defense of the liberties of the Dutch East India Company so that it could pursue colonial labor and resources in an untrammeled way. So this drive of the global north to economically exploit the global south has remained not only, it wasn't just the origin of the discipline, but it's remained a propelling force for the discipline to evolve ever since. So it's sort of long functioned, it's played this role where it protects the private economic sphere in ways that promote accumulation and thereby benefit the rich. And I mean, it's important to say, as we sit in the global south talking about this, that over the centuries, this would not have been possible without the collaboration of southern elites. And so that's what the eminent Marxist international scholar B.S. Chimney calls the transnational capitalist class today. And they had their antecedents in an equivalent since colonial times. So in this sense, international law was and is based on extracting economic value from people and from the planet. And for centuries, the discipline of international law was used to justify European empire, genocide, settler colonialism, slavery, apartheid, racial discrimination, all of which not only allowed the global north to accumulate their power, but crucially in the context of climate change, it enabled the industrialization of the global north. And excuse me, over the course of the 20th century, through international laws and institutions, it was a very efficient way of universalizing and normalizing unsustainable and inequitable development pathways worldwide, and it erased sustainable alternatives that existed locally in the global south. And I mean, not to say that the global south was always equal or sustainable either, but there were alternatives that existed that were more equal and sustainable, and they've been erased because of this sort of universal understanding of what it means to be a developed human being. And there's a tendency nowadays to sort of treat climate change as though it's some sort of emergency, that it's a new problem that came up in recent decades. And so we tend to respond to it quite reactively as a result. But what I like about your question is that it reminds us that climate change has been centuries in the making, that it is a historical issue, that its origins lie in the Industrial Revolution and in the colonialism and the genocide and the slavery and the racism that enabled the Industrial Revolution. And so I think especially for international lawyers, it's important to remember that climate change is the inevitable consequence of an international legal system that for centuries has protected the rich and powerful from the harmful consequences of their actions. And one of the reasons why the discipline, well, the main reason why the discipline functions in this way is that it was created and it continues to be dominated by rich, white, propertied men who can postulate these universal norms in their own image and to their own benefit. And then as time went on, we have the participation of people like us, but that's tolerated only to the extent to which we can imitate them, So whether on a societal level, by states by communities in the global south emulating the Western sovereign state, by forming these sovereign states, or on the individual level by imitating their modes of education, their language, their dress, their culture, and adopting their norms. And so what I'm trying to say is that the global south participation in international law was, and indeed to a large extent still is, conditioned on the extent to which we're willing to play by the rules of this game that we didn't invent. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, as soon as third world lawyers started participating in international law, they immediately tried to change the rules of the game. And then they met with various degrees of success and failure over the centuries. And all these efforts are very much continuing into the present day, as you and I well know. And for those of us engaging in these efforts today, one of the ways to strategize effectively is to understand the history of the discipline and why it looks the way it does today. So that's why, for instance, in the article you mentioned, I used the example of Syria over the last decade to talk about how these different legal regimes, international economic law, the laws of war, refugee and migration law, and international climate law intersect to create these predictable patterns of winners and losers across this region, including in Amman in Jordan, where I now live, and indeed across across the world. And so we can trace the history of each of these specializations. When did they come about? Why did they come about? How did they come to look the way they do today? Who decided that this was the best way to do things, and, you know, best for whom? And so this historical understanding of international law provides this productive foundation for understanding not only what we need to change today, but what it would actually look like to do things differently, because sometimes we think we're doing things differently and we're not. So, you know, it does help to know the history to not fall into those traps over and over again, because I do think it's important that we have international laws and institutions. I think that they're useful. I think that they're necessary for tackling problems like climate change. Today, I think international laws and institutions contribute to making global problems like climate change worse rather than better. But there's no denying that these are global problems. And so if we want a solution, there has to be some degree of coordination and collaboration across nations. So then it becomes a question of, well, how do we create a discipline that's fit for purpose, a very different purpose than what motivated the creation of the Eurocentric discipline? And that's what movements like TWAIL, third world approaches to international law, are trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting that you mention how third world participation in international law is only tolerated to the extent that it mirrors what Eurocentric understanding of international law we have. But I found this especially interesting given that TWAIL scholars, especially when newly independent states were formed after colonization, they realized that they didn't have much of a choice but to interact with international law and to try to reform it to make it a more equal system. Of course, there are some TWAIL scholars who believe that the entire system of international law is predatory and there's no way for us to save it. But still, I'd like to focus on those TWAIL scholars who did engage in international law, and they tried to bring their understandings of natural resources, of the environment, into the development of international environmental law. So how have third world states been involved in developing the international law related to the environment after their independence?
Another good question. So I guess to really answer this question first requires an understanding of what an environmental issue is and who decides something is an environmental issue. I'm actually going to leave that question aside for now because I think it'll distract from your central point. So I'm going to answer your question on the basis of what international law thinks an environmental issue is. So in international law, the environment became part of international law in the 1970s with the origins of international environmental law, which it's usually identified as originating in the 1972 United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, commonly known as the Stockholm Conference. So that was when the environment was created as the object of international law regulation, on the assumption that international laws can protect this environment thing. So in international law textbooks, this is conventionally told as a story where there's been a global paradigm shift. But in actual fact, this type of environmentalism was very much the product of Western history and culture, because it stemmed from the rise of environmentalism in the US and in Western Europe in the 1960s, which then came out in international environmental law in the 1970s. So what third world states have been pointing out at Stockholm and ever since then is that this conceptualization of the environment is not necessarily self-evident to or shared by most of the world. That for most of the world, who's been at the receiving end of 5 centuries of European colonialism, our environmental problems are not caused by a misunderstanding of nature. They're caused by the global north systemically looting the natural resources of the global south to fuel northern wealth accumulation. And then furthermore, of course, these northern understandings of economic development, of industrialization, were universalized through decolonization, because independence for states in the global south was conditioned on a commitment to industry. So if you were not seen as competent to industrialize, you were not given sovereignty. And that's why so many tribal and indigenous people today still don't have, sovereign status. They don't have their self-determination. So post-colonial states industrialized as rapidly as they could. So against this historical background, when international environmental law came along in the 1970s, so the international lawyers from the Global South were looking at it with some ambivalence, because of course they wanted to protect the environment, but they also thought, well, this specialization is coming along, pretty close along the heels of us becoming states. And so we're finally getting a degree of economic independence, and now you want an international control of the economy to protect the environment. So there was this fear of environmental colonialism, where international environmental law would be yet another instance of using international law to universalize and normalize what were really just Western values. And so Karen Mickelson's work over the years, she does the best job, an excellent job, a beautiful job of tracing the really important contributions of third world international lawyers to environmental protection, which they've been doing for long before the 1970s, and also to international environmental law. And so we really owe a great deal to these third world international lawyers and their inspirational efforts over the years, and we can learn a lot from their successes, but also their failures in terms of how we would strategize today. So what did they do? Well, they did a lot of different things because there's so many countries. So post-independence responses, and in each country had internal battles about what models they wanted to follow in terms of environment and development as well. So there were so many responses. So long before the onset of international environmental law, we had some really profound and prescient efforts to articulate different visions of development in the Global South. And so they knew that there was a need for environmental justice, that the Western development model was going to create both economic and environmental injustice. So they tried to say, well, what about notions of self-reliance, for instance? That's probably the best known example historically, that was based on accounting for this inner limit of what you need to satisfy human needs, while also taking into account the outer limit of planetary boundaries. And these different understandings of development drew on the fact that in many localities, there were intertwined holistic understandings of economy and ecology, and that can be drawn on these rather than importing development ideologies. For the most part, however, at the state level, ruling elites across the Global South capitulated to industry as rapidly as they could. For them, then the demand was not so much, we want our right to define development on our own terms, but it was more that, well, we accept your Western definitions of development as industry, but we demand the right to participate as equals in the global economy. So it was in this sense that third world states demanded a new international economic order in the 1960s and 1970s. And this was new in the sense that you described, that they wanted permanent sovereignty over natural resources. They wanted fair share of resources in the deep seabed, in the high seas, in outer space, in other territories outside sovereign jurisdiction, that was articulated as the common heritage of mankind, or humankind as we call it today. So third world international lawyers in this post-independence era played a really important role in articulating each of these international law principles, and actually much more than this. The things beyond environmental law that were really, really important for environmental law, like the principle of self-determination for all peoples, the outlawing of apartheid and racial discrimination, the principle of sovereign equality and non-intervention, and so on. So when international environmental law came along, third world states insisted from the beginning that there has to be legal recognition that the rich contribute unequally to this problem of global environmental harm, and they need to do most of the work to protect the environment, not only because they caused it, but also because as a result of enriching themselves, they're just in a better position to do it now because they have the capacity to do it. So we have these principles like sustainable development and common but differentiated responsibility that articulate precisely this. They say you need to balance the need to address poverty and inequality in the South while mitigating the environmental harms caused by the North. And so the global North has to do most of the mitigating, and they also have to compensate the South for their efforts through technology and financial transfers and expertise and so on. So third world international lawyers continue to play an important role in international environmental law. For instance, in Sharm last year, the most recent climate COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, with the climate loss and damage mechanism. So they've been insisting on these things over the years in every single meeting, climate change and beyond, in biodiversity, in all environmental fronts. What's worrying, of course, is that these principles are all very well and good, but they haven't been turned into action because rich states have just simply refused to abide by them. So there were very clear laws that allocated differential responsibilities under the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, that the US refused to join, even though at that time it was the biggest emitter. And then this demotivated other rich states in Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand that had joined Kyoto because they would be at an economic disadvantage because the US wasn't doing those things. So it doesn't really work unless everyone participates, especially the world's biggest emitter. And then now we have the Paris Agreement, which is a massive dilution of common but differentiated responsibilities because they've become these voluntary, vague or aspirational targets rather than the required targets they were under Kyoto. And here again, in the lead up to Paris, we had so many alternatives put forward by countries across the global south, together and separately, saying we know that we are emitting more as emerging economies. There are ways to take this into account. There are ways to calculate for this. And so many proposals and equations were put forward, and they were all defeated by the US because the US insisted that we're not going to participate unless emissions targets are voluntary. So the end result has been that we've had 30 years of international climate law where we've actually emitted more than in all of human history before that. So this is a colossal disciplinary failure by any measure. So it's not that third world international lawyers haven't participated in creating important legal principles. They've done a fantastic job at that, but not at tackling climate change.
And I think this is where we come back to this breakdown of the universality or the equal playing field that international law claims to have. Of course, all states are equally subjects of international law, and international law is voluntary based on how states want to engage with it. But still, when you look at the third world or the global south, and you compare that to states like the US, the power that the US and these industrialized economies have compared to the global south, it makes clear that this is not a level playing field. And not everybody is regulated by international environmental law the same way, because they can always choose to drop out of the Paris Agreement. And the impact that has on the efficacy of the Paris Agreement is so different than if a third world state chose not to engage in that. And also, if you look at the kinds of retaliation that would take place against third world states who chose not to engage with it, in terms of sanctions, not being a primary trading partner because of their poor environmental background. And we're kind of seeing that as well with GSP Plus, where states are being required to sign and ratify certain environmental law treaties in order to get those preferential trading benefits. So I think, again, this comes back to the critique that third world approaches to international law has always put forward, that this is not an equal playing field. And often I think it gives us that you get a sense of loss, because what can third world states then do in order to tackle the system or to even play in this game?
Well, I think that for me, what I learned from looking at the history of the way third world international lawyers have interacted with these regimes is that some things have worked better than others. And I think that it is important to say, it is important to say, we're not going to play by the rules of this game. We acknowledge that the game exists and it affects us, so we can't ignore it and just move on because it affects us, whether we play it or not. So in that sense, there's not much of a choice in terms of the impact of international laws and institutions in the global south. But it is to say, well, we are going to participate in it on our own terms, in our own languages, in our own ways. And I think that it is possible to do that. I think that it is, because unlike it, I think that when it comes to problems like climate change, the problem is that when you have the richest 20% causing this problem, there isn't much that 80% can do. But on the other hand, the way these industries are fueled are very much built on the labor and the resources from the 80%. So in that sense, there is a moment where those processes can be disrupted. It's not as though the global south is completely powerless. So it is a question of building solidarity and mobilizing in that way. And traditionally, the way those solidarities have been fractured is through racism, through saying, well, global south states are actually competitors with each other rather than in solidarity with each other, that we're going to have a war because of religion or ethnicity or culture or whatever. So there have been so many ways to fracture solidarity across the South, or solidarity across the underclasses, even within the society, through ideologies of discrimination and racism. So I think that we would have to overcome that in order to realize our own power. And that's one of the things that we see in moments like the Bandung Conference, in history, that maybe some of that needs to be brought back today, because from the 80s onwards, all of that was lost, and it was every state for itself because there was a debt crisis, and then global south states just went their separate ways. I think that it's not impossible to do today. I think it's just that people are trying to do it not on the state level. So, for instance, TWAIL tries to do that for international law scholars and practitioners transnationally. Mm-hmm. And then we find that there are so many people in the North who are in a similar position because there's poverty and inequality increasing there. So there are people working in solidarity across the global North and South who are at the receiving end of all these problems. It's just that I think at the state level, Southern elites have long sold us out. So, we have to find other ways to collaborate, because there's too many incentives for them to be captured by private sector internationally. So I think that, especially when it comes to climate change, we have such powerful transnational corporate interest, more powerful than states, that we're dealing with, that there has to be another kind of transnational solidarity that doesn't rely on the state to mobilize against them. And I think that TWAIL today tries to do that in academia, but of course, to actually be successful, we need to collaborate with social movements that do that, international civil servants that do that. And so we try and build those alliances and help each other.
Mm-hmm. And now I want to come to the question that you had set aside on how we understand the environment. So this is also something that you discuss in your co-edited book, Locating Nature, Making and Unmaking International Law. So you suggest that environmental change requires more than just demands for fairness and redistribution, that it demands this re-examination of international law's assumptions about the natural world. So can you explain exactly what you mean about that re-examination for those who haven't read the article or your book?
So, well, as you say, here I am talking about who decides what the environment is and for what purpose this idea was created. So as I mentioned before, international law's understanding of the environment stems from Western environmentalism in the 1960s and 70s. And that was because at that time in the US and in Western Europe, the Western middle classes started feeling the impact of rapid industry. So they had higher levels of air and water pollution, more oil spills. It was the height of the Cold War, so they were worried about nuclear pollution and so on. So, and it also coincided with advances in Western science at the time that increased public awareness about how complex and interconnected and unique and fragile our planet was. So we had, space travel and the first pictures of Earth from space that were used as symbols of the Western environmental movements. And then in the US, you had in the 60s the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency. And then from that, in the 70s, we have international law's engagement with the environment with the Stockholm Conference. So in this origin story, the environment first becomes the object of international law as the object of law stewardship, because that was when international lawyers realized that it's desirable to protect the environment, and more importantly, that they thought it was possible to protect the environment in that way. And so you sort of hear in a standard environmental law textbook, if you just open the initial chapter, it usually tells you that, well, before the 60s and 70s, states and people were told to control nature through science, industry, and modernity, control nature. But then from the 60s and 70s onwards, humanity turned away from mere mastery towards also protecting and cherishing nature. And that's how nature became an object of international regulation. Now, for most of the world, for the global south, this type of environmentalism is very much the product of Western history, Western culture, and Western experience with the environment. But this understanding of the environment has become so natural for us now. And, that's how we use the word. And Western environmentalism has shaped and dominated global discourse. And that, again, erases the fact that in the world, there are lots of alternative understandings of nature, of the part of human beings in nature, let alone the part of law in all of that. So this is what I mean by saying that environmental problems require more than redistribution, because if we were to calculate all the available consumption and pollution possible on our planet while remaining sustainable for future generations, that's actually what the Kyoto Protocol did. And then if we were to divide this quota fairly, taking into account historical overconsumption and so on, that's literally what the Kyoto Protocol did, and everyone observed the law, this would not, in fact, solve the problem of environmental destruction. It would only postpone it. Because ecological harm is not just a product of capitalism. So we can't actually combat it simply by redistributing through socialism. It's actually a product of industrialization, which underlies both those systems, and which stems from a particular way of seeing the world as infinitely amenable to human control. That whatever the problem is, we can solve it because we control the world, we control life. And this conceptualizing of the environment as the object, therefore, of international legal regulation, because of course international law can regulate anything, has been a massive regulatory failure. So we might want to think about whether that's true, whether international law can control everything. And underlying this, there's this more fundamental problem of just scientific inaccuracy and disciplinary hubris, that we're talking about something, the environment, that's a referent to all that exists, to the universe, creation, however one wishes to understand all of existence. And just as what we today have called natural resources provide the foundation for all economic activity and all economic law, the so-called environment underlies every area of human life, every discipline of human knowledge, certainly every area of international law, because it provides the basis for human life. So in that sense, international lawyers can't really physically separate ourselves from the environment because we're always in it. Yet conceptually, we occupy a position from outside it, where we look at it and we decide how to govern it. And so this is what Vassos Argiu talks about in the logic of environmentalism. He says that this type of conceptual position is a characteristic of Western modernity, because Western modernity always has to make metaphysical totalizations. It has to say, I know and I can make a decision about what exists in its entirety. And so that's how these knowledge disciplines since the European Enlightenment onwards have been created. And so you have a conceptual venturing outside the world, because it's only from being outside the world that you can look at the world and say, here's the boundaries of the world and here's the knowledge of what's there, And in this sense, the pictures of the Earth from space are a really good representation of Western environmentalism, because they show the entire planet captured within Western modern thought. But we know, scientists know, that the environment can't be accurately understood as the object of governance, because exceeding it is as much a conceptual impossibility as a physical impossibility, as a scientific impossibility. So as we start to learn more about how complex the web of natural interactions are that create and sustain life, then we realize more and more how far we are from fully understanding nature and our part in it. So instead of producing regulatory solutions, the law's ability to conceptually isolate itself from nature has helped to create environmental catastrophe. And law plays a really important role in doing this. It takes a unified planet and changes it into discrete sovereign territories. Mm-hmm. It takes nature and turns it into exchangeable property and contracts. And it takes these interconnected ecosystems and turns them into these realms of infinite commodification and exchange. And with human rights, it takes and extracts the human individual and separates them from the intertwined mesh that actually creates and keeps them alive. So law not only enables environmental destruction, but it understands the environment in a way that means that remedy is impossible. And the only way to remedy this is to exit the confines of Western modernity. And that's what I mean when I say we need more than redistribution. Because we need to go beyond an international law that's constantly reconfirming the position of the West as the source of all acceptable meaning. That the failures of international environmental law clearly show that we need alternatives, and a genuinely international solution to environmental problems needs an openness to these other philosophical and theoretical understandings, not only of the relationship between people and nature, but on what law is and the role of law in all of this. And they exist, right? There are plenty of cultures that have managed, despite globalized capitalism, to survive and live sustainably. And they have these philosophical understandings. So can international law hear and understand and give voice and make place for those understandings? That would be what we really need in order to find a more sustainable way of life. And so in that sense, environmental change on the scale that we're seeing today, I mean, today, the rate of mass extinction, the amount of greenhouse gases in the air are unprecedented for our species. The last time these things happened were millions and millions of years ago, before human beings existed. So they are not, we can't respond to them the same way that we responded to other problems in the past. They are actually a challenge to knowledge production. Definitely in the social sciences, to some extent, even in the natural sciences. So, so we need to have a pretty fundamental transformation of the discipline. And, so things like the Locating Nature Project and various other projects in international law are trying to do that.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that you mention these communities who have been able to survive being insulated from this international, transnational capitalist economy, because even within current climate change discourse, we recognize that these indigenous communities or minority communities, that they understand their relationship with the environment way better than the rest of the world has been able to. And despite understanding and recognizing that, we only provide them with this symbolic representation at our Conference of the Parties or even in negotiations. So there's that recognition that they're way ahead of us, but still we're not going to include them in these negotiations, or we're just going to pat them on the back and say good job, but we're not going to learn from them. So that's also really interesting that there's that realization, but that momentum isn't there to create some sort of change in these negotiations.
Well, I mean, it's worse than that, right? Because they're actually the prime targets of corporations now, because they're sitting on the last remaining pockets of these resources. So, and Pakistan is part of this. There's a tribal belt across South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, north of India, Nepal, through to Burma, that are intersecting tribal communities that have managed somehow to survive, and now they are the target of corporate interest, domestic and international, right? So it's not just that we're not giving them the respect they deserve in international fora, it's that they are getting assassinated daily because they stand up for what they believe in, and states collaborate with, militias and corporations to just shoot them down. I mean, it's getting worse and worse every week. We get more statistics on how many people are being assassinated for trying to protect their way of life. Yeah.
And I think a lot of the things that we've discussed in this conversation, they've led me to this belief that, okay, international law would benefit from being a genuinely global space with multiple worldviews, where we identify a truly sustainable and equitable way of living. And so I want to ask you, what role does TWAIL and other critical approaches to international law, what do they play in ensuring or just creating a change within international law relating to the environment?
Well, this is obviously something that, both you and I think about every day in terms of what international lawyers from the South can do about all of this. For me, one important thing on the climate front is to say that, that we do want restitution for being on the front lines of harm, because one of the benefits from international law becoming a genuinely international space is that automatically changes the nature of the discipline, because it is the vast majority of the world that is facing many of these problems, not just environmental problems, but economic problems, social problems. There are very few that actually benefit from this system. So by creating a more democratic international law, of course, it's going to change the nature of the discipline, because the main problem is that it is right now a discipline created by and for elites. Mm-hmm. So that would automatically change its nature. And I think that would allow voices to say that when it comes to climate change, it's great that there might be one day a loss and damage mechanism, mm-hmm. but we don't just want restitution. We also want truth, and that's what's been missing. And, when and if restitution is ever made, and it doesn't look like it's going to be, but if restitution is ever made for climate change, and, for other things that have already happened, like genocide or slavery or apartheid or colonialism, if restitution is ever made for those things, it entails the capacity to tell the truth. Like a new type of legal system that doesn't obfuscate the facts, and a new type of legal discourse that doesn't render mass suffering unspeakable. That, the amount of effort we have to go through even to say the things that we've said today required a lot of work from scholars that came before us, because the discipline renders our truths unspeakable. And the rich are robbing the poor of what the rich are actually incapable of reinstating. How do you reinstate the submergence of an entire sovereign nation, the loss of an entire culture, the loss of everything that's there, not just for humans, but all the species that have gone, And then the poor just have to learn to live with a loss that is irreparable. So even if law one day brings recompense for the injustices of colonialism, genocide, slavery, climate change, it will be partial, and that doesn't mean compensation is unnecessary. Of course it's necessary. But, I think it was Akil Mbebe who said that compensating doesn't mean that you're erasing the wrong. It doesn't erase the need to remember what happened, to remind people what happened, and to honor the truth. That at its heart, when restitution is made for something, it's an offer to repair a relationship. And I think that's what TWAIL is asking for. That, we need to lift up and listen to those who are systemically silenced within international law. Not only due to their gender and race and class and culture and sexuality, but also on the level of species. There are so many vectors of injustice, and climate change is a reminder that truth is not only a vital part of law, but it is also a condition for the survival of our world. And I think that for me, TWAIL has been absolutely central to my academic praxis, because it tells the truth about how the Global South experiences international law. and international institutions. And this is just not abstract. I've been in the Middle East for the past 14 years. Everyone from like the person sweeping up the garbage to the person sitting in the presidential palace knows what the IMF and what international institutions have done. It's not actually in any way complex or theoretical or abstract. It's affected everything from the price of bread and sugar to employment opportunities. Everyone can understand that, you know, and I think that TWAIL allows us to speak that truth. Most of my work, as you said, has been with academia and with the UN. So it very much ends up being about, well, how can I bring people into the arenas that I'm in that are traditionally excluded? And that's mainly through hiring, through admissions, through scholarships, through policies and procedures, through publication, through editing. Who do we prioritize? Who do we help? Who do we stand up for? And then just by doing things differently, we do change the discipline. I mean, I've seen that happen. I've seen people do that for me. And I've done that for people, and we do change the discipline, you know. And well, you know that because you're doing the same thing there with your organization. So specifically for the environment, with the Locating Nature project, for instance, what Julia Dem and I are trying to do there is to say, what lessons can we draw from local, domestic, and transnational developments that are usually ignored in silence? So we start off saying the environment underpins all of international law, and let us explain to you how the environment plays a huge part in areas of law that you think it doesn't, like environmental law, of course, but also labor law, migration law, asylum law. All of these areas of law have something to do with the environment, and they can change when we bring in these local developments that are usually ignored in silence. So we try to do that just by bringing more people into the project to talk about, you know, the different understandings of nature and law in the peasant movements in Ecuador, that or, you know, class actions in the Philippines, or these tribal mobilizations across, you know, South Asia, and all these rights of nature movements, which once you look into them, you realize this rights of nature is an oversimplification of what they're doing. You know, it's actually much more profound than that. And, you know, the climate justice movements of small island states, and just massive protests across India and China that have to do with, you know, places where people are getting cancer and all kinds of diseases, and they know why it's happening. So there are these amazing local developments that could inform the international space in a useful way, not necessarily an exact match, but if they were allowed to enter the international space, maybe we would have better ideas, you know, that could work on the global scale. And that's definitely needed, because what we're talking about is a very, very powerful, entrenched global structure of violence. And to combat them, it's a really high stakes endeavor. And that's why we see so many more murders and assassinations now of environmental defenders worldwide, not because then they don't know what to do or they're not collaborating effectively. It's because they're doing an excellent job. That's why they're being killed, you know. And the movements just keep growing anyway, because there's no choice. For those who have no choice, like where we live, what is there to lose at this point? You know, and I think that for those of us who want global cooperation on these issues, it is a question of bringing those voices together, however we can. It doesn't have to be through the UN, but I think transnational solidarity helps, and that's what TWAIL tries to do. For instance, one of the things we've been preparing for over the last few months is we're having a TWAIL Academy in Bogota. In a couple of weeks' time, we start. And that's just bringing together international law scholars and practitioners from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. To each of them brings a paper that they're working on. We introduce them to some TWAIL texts, and then we say to them, like, you know, the purpose of you being here is not just for us or for TWAIL to help you, but for you to inform TWAIL and say, well, is this completely useless? Can this be more useful to what you're actually doing? And to have that conversation, and then beyond that, for them to just make friends with each other and help each other, because as I said, this discipline is designed to make sure that we don't achieve these goals. So the only way to do it, the only way to achieve our goals is to help each other. So it is a lot about just making those connections across the South as well. So as an academic, this is one way that I'm trying to do that. And then, of course, through the TWAIL review, but there are so many people doing things through the UN, through their governments and, you know, societies like yours that are all trying to change international law so that it can actually be something that's interested in global justice rather than the opposite.
Mm-hmm. And I really like this conception of TWAIL as a tool to get the truth, because I think at the crux of it, that's what everybody is looking for, just truthfulness in what has happened and what is happening today. So thank you so much, Usha. This has been a really enlightening conversation for me, and I'm sure that our audience is going to learn a lot from it.
Thank you. It's been great for me as well, and I wish you all the best in this endeavor. It's a great idea.
Thank you so much.